So thank you everyone for joining what is our first ever panel discussion group. It's something that I've wanted to do for a while. But it's just time's a big factor in most things, isn't it? I'm delighted to be joined by some brilliant members from our community. Is a Josh and Johnny, and you guys I think gave me the prod to do this one. So thank you very much for doing that. How are you? You all getting on? You okay?
All right. Very excited to be here.
Very good. And of course, we're very excited to welcome our very special guest, Mr. Stephen Aryan. How are you doing, Steve?
I'm good, thanks, Richie. Thanks for having us.
Oh, thank you very much for joining us. It means a lot to us that you've given enough time out of your very busy schedule to join us, because we all look up to writers like you. And I don't know about everyone else here, but I love to learn from people who are doing it the right way and doing it really well too. So it's the best way to get insights. And panels, I think they're a really interesting thing as well. Like the first ever one I went to was in FantasyCon a few years ago, and I learned so much. And I think it's just because you get 4 or 5 perspectives rather than just 1 or 2. Well, yeah, have you done quite a few panels then before, Steve?
Yeah. So before I was published, I was going to conventions and panels the same as everybody else to learn as much as I could from other writers, listening to agents, editors, publishers, just everybody talk. And I just tried to soak up as much information as I could about writing books, the industry, publishing, all of it, because as much as this is a creative thing, you have to have an awareness that it's obviously a business, and you need to have some of that business acumen and at least a basic understanding of how it all works. And I think some writers, the dream for me, the goal was always to get an agent. And then once I've got an agent, you get a contract. And then it's like, okay, how does all this work? So yeah. The more you know of that ahead of time, the more you are prepared. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And one of the reasons that I want to do these panels is because you get a real insight into quite specific subjects. And I remember going to one quite a similar subject that you mentioned there about how the industry's changed, and it had Adrian Tchaikovsky and Juliet McKenna on it, and he just explains so much that you wouldn't learn from reading like a blog post or whatever. And yeah, it was amazing. And I think what we'd like to do in this community anyway, there's about 350 of us now, it's grown very quickly, is do more of these kind of things and get real insights on specific subjects. And one topic in particular that everyone loves is world building, but it's riddled with traps. I think it's fair to say. And I've been reading The Judas Blossom, which is Steve's new book, coming out in a couple of months, and the world is absolutely sensational just because it's so unlike anything I've read before. And I think that's a good place to start. So, Steve, do you fancy telling us a bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to do a book that was very, very different, and I wanted to challenge myself, and it turned out to be the most difficult series I've ever written, which is a problem for myself. So this is a historical fantasy series. So all of the main events in the first book are historically accurate. They all happened. Who was there and the order and the timing has been changed for the purposes of the story. So there's a note in the front of the book, which you would have seen, Richie, that says, whilst I've tried to honor history, I haven't been an absolute slave to it, because it would prevent me sometimes from telling a dramatic story, because sometimes wars in history will go on for like 2, 3, 4 years. And that's a whole trilogy by itself. I can't just have a book that's full of a trilogy. So sometimes I'll sort of say, this things, and I skip over sections so that this major event has happened, and then the story can carry on. So there's, it's not a spoiler, there's like a siege of a city in the story at one point, and that happened. All of the characters in the book, most of them are real people, but some of them are fictional, and sometimes we don't know very much about them from history. So I've said, right, there's a massive gap there. I'm going to extrapolate that and do something complete my own, because we don't know. So historians would get upset However, it is historical fantasy. So there is some made up stuff in there. There's some mild fantastical elements. It isn't magic heavy. There aren't like non-human races because it is Earth and it is set in 1260. So it is very much our planet and stuff that's happened. But I've just added some kind of what if scenarios and maybe, and then I've woven a story like a slalom skier hitting all these points in history. And that was incredibly difficult. So I don't know why I did it to myself, but there you go.
Sounds great though, and like you say, it's taking something that's you're sort of familiar with, and then asking what if. It seems to be the starting point, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I've got a stack of books that I've read about this era, and it's some things I've used and some things I've ignored on purpose, because the more roadblocks I put in place, the more difficult it is for a reader to get into this world. And if you're not familiar with it, so as far as I know, someone will probably correct me, as far as I know, there are no other historical fantasy novels set in Persia. There's historical fiction, there's historical fiction set in Mongolia. Like I've said, Con Egulden has done some great historical fiction stories that are as close to the truth as we know. I think he's added a bit of drama himself, but there's none set in Persia and there's none set in like the 13th century ever. So
Nice.
that was going to be a challenge. And then people are going into this whole new world that they don't know anything about. And the more terms I add in, the more I feel it can knock someone out of the story. So I don't, and also like the language, I don't use modern phrases or slang or terms, because I want people to feel like they're in this part of history. There was one thing in the story which I took out. The proofreader said, this feels like a bit of anachronism. Someone's drinking a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
And then we started getting into the debate of, would there be coffee in 1260 in Persia, and would it have come over from South Africa? And I spoke to my dad, who is from the Middle East, and he's like, technically no. However, it could have come from Ethiopia and been important. I was like, you're right. But it still feels awkward. So I've taken it out, and just, people are stuck drinking tea and so on. So there's things like that. It's getting the balance right. But the book involves the Mongolians invading Persia, their occupation of it, and the stories about a rebellion fighting back from the inside. But there's lots of terms in Mongolian like warfare that I've removed on purpose. So there's a different term for someone that commands like 10 soldiers, 100, 1,000. So there's 3 new words I've got to throw in, and you won't know what that means. And every time I start doing that, so like think of like Peter Brett did it with The Warded Man. He started trickling in little words all the way through. By the time he got to the 4th book, I had to keep flicking back to the glossary because I had no idea what some of these terms were. And I was like, I don't want that. I don't want people to keep like knocking themselves out the story. So I haven't used those terms. And I've used ranks in the army that people will understand, because the majority of the readers, until it gets translated, will be English speakers, which means they're based in the West, or they're English language speakers based around the world, or they're expats, So I've kept things like lieutenant, captain, and you understand it's an army, you understand it's a rank. And they did have those ranks in Mongolian army in that period, but the word is different again. So like, how many terms do I add in before you're like, I don't know what's going on. I can't follow the story because I'm stumbling all the time. So finding that balance is tricky. But it's just trial and error, and getting proofreaders and beta readers to be like, I don't understand what this means.
Yeah. I know, Josh, you had a question on the specific thing, didn't you? About how can you make your world unique without like making it too difficult?
Yeah, just with thinking about it, when you have a whole other world, and it also applies to historical fantasy as well, how do you make it so that the reader can understand still and not have too much of a learning curve, while making it different from Earth enough that it feels realistic? Like, because there wouldn't be Earth stuff in a fantasy world, right?
Yes and no. So here's the yes. Oh, well, okay. It's all about barriers again. In every fantasy book that you've ever read, anybody, what kind of things do they eat if they go into a tavern? What kind of food do they predominantly eat? What kind of meat do they eat? Yeah. And if it's not our Earth, it's a fantasy world that you've completely created. Why are there chickens? Why are there cows? Why are there... It wouldn't be anything. Why does it have to be that? Why aren't they eating flagonberries? And you start making up all these terms, and then people are there again going like, I don't know what's going on. So there's a bit of sleight of hand where one, everybody's speaking English, or at least you're reading it in English, unless you start introducing other languages and people have communication problems. And is that a facet of the story? If it's not, does it need to be there? Is the food a big thing? If it's not, you can add stuff to it, interesting spices, interesting things that you need for the story. Some people have had like certain flowers that grant certain abilities that they've made up rather than because they need it for the story. Like a certain flower that grows on a mountain that's really remote gives someone magic for 12 hours or whatever it might be, or, you know. So there again, if it's set in this Earth, or your story's set in Earth, what are you adding to it that makes it a little bit different? Is it non-human races? Because then people love that. You get to describe that whole cloth. You get to kind of say, right, this is this thing, this is this race, this is what they look like, this is how they talk, this is how they walk. And people have to kind of get on board with it and from the way you describe it. But yeah, there's always sleight of hand where people just take things as written. They walk in and they have a beef stew. And you're like, okay, I know what that means. I don't have to explain it.
Nice. Oh, Izzy, you had a few points to ask on this one, didn't you?
We sometimes gravitate towards like the standard fantasy setting, right? Like Middle Ages. How can you build something different? But again, that is not too different as you have to explain every single bit. Or how can you change something in this standard setting, but still make it work? For example, can I have books being something common in the Middle Ages? Does it work? Or how can I make this work? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, so it's a version of our Earth, but you want to change something a little bit. Yeah, so it's like a parallel Earth that's something a bit different. Yeah, so you can, as long as you think of the repercussions, how it affects everything in society. And equally within a fantasy world, if you introduce something, you have to think about the repercussions of how it affects everything. So has anybody read the Draconis Memoria series by Anthony Ryan?
No.
Okay, so in that world, I've read the first two books. In that world, there are dragons, and there's different kinds of dragons, but they're commoditized in a way. So what they've discovered is they've discovered that if you imbibe a small quantity of blood from a dragon, it gives you an ability, and depending on the color of the dragon, the breed essentially, it has a different effect. So that was kind of like the seed of his idea. And it could be Earth, but it's not. It's, another planet. And then based upon that, he's then gone, right, what does that mean? So if the dragons live out in the wild somewhere, you have to have people that go out and hunt them, which means they have to be trained, they have to be mercenaries, they have to be skilled, they have to learn how to fight dragons and that. And then there's people who are like essentially the merchants who are paying for all of this and who are funding it. And then it sort of ripples out. It's got to the point where if you like overfish a river, all the fish die, and then you're kind of stuffed and you have to kind of wait for them to recoup and stuff. So they're getting to this point in this world where there are too many people going out, being paid to go and get dragons to get this blood because it's an important commodity. So they're trying to raise them, they're trying to capture them, tame them, and raise them like, in pens essentially for the same purpose, but it doesn't work the same. The dragons aren't as fierce and it doesn't have the same quality. And it's like, so every time he's put something in, he's thought about what's the knock-on effect and how does that affect the next thing?
Yeah.
So if it's magic, it's like, has everybody got it or has nobody got it? Is it a few people? If it's everybody, how does that affect everything? Travel, food, and you just kind of, world building is fun. World building is brilliant. I love doing it. And you should look for the holes that people don't fall down when they're reading the story. But equally, you shouldn't spend 10 years world building and not writing the story. Some of these things you'll come to as you start working through the story. You'll be like, I've just suddenly thought of that thing and that doesn't make sense now. I think you have to go away and think about it and someone can fill the plot hole. But you can change something and like set it in history. So if you say, so my book's set in the 1300s. If I introduced, I don't know, something really like, I was going to say astronomy, but astronomy was already there and the rest of it to do with the weather and they were very aware of it. Well, if I introduce something from our time to the present, to the 13th century, how would it affect everybody? What would it be? Like, what's that Outlander? The woman who travels back from modern day times to thing. I've not read the book, so I don't know this, but she has an advanced knowledge, surely, of medicine. So she goes back to the whatever period it is. How does that affect her? Will people start thinking she's a witch because they are using leeches? And she's like, no, it's germs. And they're like, what's a germ? We can't see them. We have to have them, why, what do you mean I can't see them? And so then it's like, it's that constant thing of, okay, how does it ripple out? It's like dropping a pebble into a pond. How does it affect everything else? And you may not get everything, but you've got to just try and think it through as logically as you can. Go ahead.
The things that we change, they have to matter. They have to like impact the story.
It has to be integrated. Like one guy I was talking to saying, I've got these characters, got this stuff, and now I'm starting to do the world building. I'm like, well, they must be integrated. Whatever the world is going to affect the characters and vice versa. It can't be separate. It has to be one thing. Otherwise, they're just two people sat in a room talking. What, it's just on stage then. It's just like a theater thing. So it has to be integrated.
Yeah. Jonny, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's so interesting because, the closer you keep it to an Earth-like planet, the easier it is. You can rely on that, right? Like it's a tool that you can use what's already familiar with people. So the more you get into like second world created fantasy, which is what I write, and it's really difficult because you want to bring people into the world, but like Steven says, you don't want them having to thumb through an appendix the whole time. You like want them immersed in the story. So you have to figure out, I use like a mashup technique usually, right? I take something that's going to be familiar enough to people and then change something about it to make it unique, right? So you can still use those things, but you can't say like a microwave. That doesn't exist, right? Or like coffee, like Steven was saying. So you can change the color of it. You can change the texture of something, or just think about how those things. You can use them as tools, right? And it's a layering process. It's not going to happen in the first draft. I know all the time when I'm going back through first draft stuff, it's like it feels info dumpy because you're literally generating it as you write, and that's okay. But the more you can find ways to use your characters to introduce those things through thoughts or interactions, rather than just explaining something. It's the classic show don't tell. But people forget that like just by having your characters interact with the world or thinking about the world or how things are, you get some of that explanation in. And you have to have readers tell you if it works or not. Like you're too close to the piece to know as you're creating it, like if it's coming across or how it's confusing. And you just have to, I think, be adaptable and not be so set in what you've created, to not be willing to think about it differently or change it if it's not working. Maybe you go more soft magic than a hard magic system if it's easier for you to build that in. But if you want the hard magic system or something more complicated, it needs to make sense to you and it needs to make sense to the world, but you don't have to explain everything about it to your reader, right? That's part of the mystery, and you have to trust them to be smart enough to get it. But that is really the like fine line to write, I think, as a second world like epic fantasy writer, is how much is too much, how much is not enough for them. But you'll get it in front of readers and you'll see what they gravitate towards or where they get caught up. And ultimately, like Steven was saying, you want to take them on that journey with you, not have these elements take them out of what the story.
Yeah. So what do you guys think is the biggest trap that people can fall into when it comes to building the world? Who wants to start? Do you want to start?
I don't know, because like my skills on word building, I'm still developing them. Okay. I still have a lot to learn. I tend to focus more on like characters and their conflicts than the word itself. But I think that's more or less what Jonny was saying, like when it's too much and when it's too little, because it is fun building a world. It is so much fun.
Yeah.
But like
too much fun.
yeah, like when do you stop? When it's enough. Like, do I have to know every single nation and kingdom
I know
that won't interact with my story? Like, or is it like enough if I'm talking about these people here, so I'm just gonna build around them? So I don't know, something like that. When figuring out what do you need, what you're missing, and when you have just too much and you're building stuff that you will not use later.
Yeah. Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that I'm going back almost to what Stephen was saying earlier about the ripple effect. I guess I'll call it that, the ripple effect of changing one thing and seeing how that spreads out. I think that a big trap you can fall into is changing something too massive. For example, if you change something like the astronomy of the world, like for example, in my story, my story has no moon or sun. Instead, there's these meteoric blazes, and the effects of that can be really massive. And so the ripple effect can be so large that it's too much of a learning curve. And so I think it's really important to not bite off more than you can chew. And so, or to limit your change. So for example, instead of trying, I'll use my example of the meteoric objects. The sun on Earth provides heat, right? The right amount of heat, temperature for us to live. And so instead of going into the science of what temperature do these blazes or these meteoric objects have to be to make sure humans can live, you just say, it just does. Or you address it, obviously not that bluntly, but you just create a solution that's much simpler than like the very scientific thing that is needed to actually make it full on realistic. And so I think that is just really important to not take on more than you can chew. But what do you guys think about that? I mean, do you guys agree, disagree?
Yeah, I think that was gonna, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go on.
I was just gonna say, I think that the one thing I wrote down is like, don't get caught up in perfect when you're starting to write, right? Plausible is enough. And don't get hung up on something that you can't figure out in the moment, and keep writing the story. Like, you have to trust your subconscious mind will figure those things out as you, like, sometimes you have to move forward to really figure out where you're going. And it's okay to just throw a bucket in there and be like, come back to this and figure out how it works with, you know, my world has two suns. So when you were talking about that, Joshua, it reminded me of when I realized like I was thinking about it wrong, and it wasn't gonna go one sun and then the other sun, like it was different, and it took me down this whole rabbit hole. But you can't let that stop you. Like, you'll figure that stuff out, and you'll find out to work into the world in your next edits and perfect it. And, you know, just don't get bogged down in, because it can feel overwhelming, right? To be like, oh, cool, I just casually have to create an entire universe where everything functions perfectly and I understand every facet of society and, you know, how everything works. But you don't. You just need to know enough so that your story makes sense and that it's fun, and the rest you can explore. So like, don't let that get you caught up, because I've been there before, where you just build a roadblock for yourself and you get caught figuring out how you're going to make some, you know, something work. But there are parts of my story that I'm even now just fleshing out in my like third draft, right? That, oh, this is how this is going to work. Like, you'll get an idea later on for something. So don't let it stop you from getting the story out. But it does need to be at least plausible, but not perfect. It's okay. It's not going to be perfect.
A good way to start is, because someone's asking the question about where do I start with world building?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Rather than go, you know, start thinking about, oh, I'm going to have 3 suns and 12 moons, and then, you know, draw a map and complicate things. It's just like, before you get to any of that, because people always want to see a map. And there again, the difficulty is, the more you draw in, the more you fill in. At some point, even if you never touch it in that story, you then locked yourself in, and if you ever do any stories in that same world again, you're like, oh, I'm going over here and there's going to be an ocean. Oh, wait, there's a massive landmass. I can't do that now. So what some people do is they make 1 or 2 small changes and have an Earth-like world as your basic platform. So assume there's 365 days. Assume there's 1 sun and 1 moon. And if they're not important to the story, you don't really talk about them. You just kind of mention them in passing, and that's it. You don't need to worry about it. But you could change one thing. And this is something that R.J. Barker has done in his stories. So if you've read the Tide Child trilogy, which starts with the bone ships, he's changed one major thing in the world, in that there's no wood anywhere. So all of the ships in the world are made from the bones of dragons, to the point where, like I talked before about with the dragons in Anthony Ryan's, they've killed all of the dragons and used their bones to make ships, and now there's no more dragons, or there's no more ships, so they have to maintain the ones they've got and look after them. But this isn't a spoiler, this is the start of the first book. The story begins with someone has sighted a dragon for the first time in, like, I don't know, 100 years or whatever it is. And these aren't flying dragons, these are like 300-foot sea serpent dragons, like that kind of size dragon.
Yeah.
So suddenly there's your kicking off point. So there is other changes to society. There's other changes to other things he's brought in. There's a non-human race that has a minor role, but more or less it feels like Earth in that there's just humans, and there's pirates and there's swords and quarreling families, and then he starts to change things. Like I think it's one society is built on a matriarchy. So the mothers rule and the aunts and so on. But he started with that one thing of there's no wood anywhere in the world. What does that mean? Right. All the buildings are made from stone and this and that, and then ships. Right. Bones, dragon bones. And then off you go. And so just with that, you can start playing around with it, thinking about the knock-on effects, and start building your story in that world. You don't have to start thinking about the 12 suns and the 15 moons and how does that affect the tides and blah, blah, blah. And, just start playing around with a version of Earth. And then when you get into it, you can start thinking about, right, well, who do they pray to? Is it one god? Is it multiple gods? Are there no gods anywhere? Is it kind of, older stuff? How does that affect people's beliefs? If there's no beliefs, what does that mean? And it's just, but start with the story, start with the characters, start with a small change to an Earth-like world, and then see what happens.
That's a really, really good point. Yeah. I love that idea as well. Just getting rid of one main thing, like no wood. Yeah, that's really good. Clever. A question that we've had from our community ties into themes, and if you're writing with like a message in mind, and how can you use your world and your setting to really enhance that? And it's quite an interesting thing. I mean, I see it a lot in stories where if it's like the end of times or it's the threatening of the end of times, then it usually be set in autumn, and there'll be dying leaves on the floor and stuff like that kind of thing. Have you guys come across any stories, or do you employ anything like this when you're writing? Steve, what about you? Do you want to start?
So using the world as kind of to feature into the story.
To build your themes.
I don't often use the world necessarily as part of the theme. It might come out later. Sometimes I know what the theme of the story is going in, and sometimes I don't. I have the characters, I have the plot, I have an idea of the story, but I don't know what the theme is. And sometimes I do, it depends. And when you finish that first draft, you can then look back and often see what you're actually talking about.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it isn't. It depends on the project. It really depends from one to the other.
Yeah.
I can give you examples, but it just changes from different series for me.
Yeah, I suppose it just depends on the kind of story you want to tell, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I always said not every book has to be deep and life-changing and it's going to make you go away and sit in a dark room and think, Some books, some TV shows, some films are just fun. They're entertaining. They're there for distraction. They're there for amusement. They're there to lift your spirits and have a good time. And there's nothing wrong with any of that because we all want fun. It doesn't have to be something that's challenging the stage. So there can be. Any book can be about any of that, but it doesn't have to be. So it depends upon what kind of storyteller you want to be within that book.
Nice.
Yeah, I think I'm going to take a bit of a unique angle on that. I think that was really good. I'm guessing that most of you guys have played board games at some point in your life.
Yeah.
And there's a thing about board games. There's two different parts to a board game. There are the mechanics of the board game, so like how the rules work and how the game functions. And then there's the theme or setting of the game. And so what is it set in? For example, I'm guessing that most of you guys have heard of Monopoly.
Yeah.
And so the mechanics of the game are like you have to rent houses and stuff and own properties. But the theme or setting of the game, it takes place on almost a block or like a city block. and you're all people that own monopolies. And so I think that translates really nicely into your story. So like Stephen was saying, you can start a story with thinking about either, I guess we can translate mechanics to plot, or like characters and stuff like that. That would be the mechanics of a story. And sometimes you have a really good plot idea or a character idea, or even almost a setting idea. Or you can have just a message that you want to send to your reader and you want to write a story around that. And sometimes you have one before the other. But I think a really good way to incorporate the two together is you think about how your world will influence situations that the character will be in, right? How will your setting or mechanics influence where the reader will go, and therefore, or where the character will go, and therefore the reader, the character in the plot will go. And so, for example, if you, I'm just gonna, this is a pretty silly theme, but if you're trying to deal with people being afraid of lava, right? And be like, you shouldn't be afraid of lava, which is pretty stupid, by the way. You should be afraid of lava. You can set your planet, or you can make your planet a volcanic world. And that's a very like dumbed down version of what I'm talking about. But if you make your story about a volcanic world, your characters are most likely going to have to deal with lava, right? And so to expand that out to other stories that you're wanting to write. And I mean, do you guys agree with what I'm saying, or do you guys have different thoughts?
I agree. I like my WIP, my work in progress. It's a female protagonist, and she deals with a bunch of conflict, but the main comes from the word, which is patriarchal. This is a hard word to say. It's based on patriarchy, and it's a misogynist kind of word. So it definitely like directly impacts her story. If you're looking for example, I think Neverwhere from by Neil Gaiman does this very well. So his team, he's working with people, homeless people. That's where the story came from. That's the theme. People who fell from the cracks into the cracks of London, and he built a world with these people who kind of like got left behind. So it's a whole world based on the theme of being homeless and forgotten. And I think that's just brilliant. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, that is amazing.
The other thing I'll just add quickly is that there's one of my friends said this. There's the story, and there's what the book is about. A lot of readers, some readers, let's say that, will get the story. They won't get what the book is about, and you can't do anything about that. When people get it and they like contact you and like, oh, what this means about this, and it's fantastic. Some people just read it and go, yeah, that was fun. It was a fun adventure. I'm like, anything else? They're like, nope. I'm like, all right, okay, fine. I don't get paid any extra. You bought the book, I win. If you got more stuff from it, that'd be even better, but it doesn't change the sale price. So you can only write the kind of story that you want to write and hope that people get beyond the surface. They scratch beyond the surface. Some readers just aren't built that way, and they just won't get it.
Yeah,
and it's kind of, you just have to kind of accept it and just be like, fine.
Especially,
I know there's more stuff there, but
yeah, it's a bit of pill to swallow, especially when you get the 1 or 2 star reviews. Don't see the point in this. Went over my head. Johnny, what do you think?
I think it's interesting because for me, like on my writing journey, and I've like been building in the same world for 20 years now. So like it just takes time, but getting to the themes really like, because for me, I realized that what my story was missing was like a part of me and diversity and all of that. And it really started influencing how I changed my world building. So like I had a species of kind of tree-like dryad people, but I had gendered them. And I was like, they probably don't have genders. They're trees. Like, and that made more sense for the story for me, you know? So like, it was fun for me to explore those things and get to like put those parts of me that were important in it. So if you're writing to a theme that's obviously important to you at the beginning of it, like find ways for that to come through authentically in the work and make your work something different. And I think that people will really gravitate towards that authenticity and that piece of you that you've put into it. And it's going to feel more real, and it's going to feel more layered and deep, because those themes are underneath of it. It doesn't have to be, you don't need to hit them with the face theme. Like, they should be feeling those things as they go through the story and discover the world with your characters. And like Steven said, you don't have to do it. Sometimes it just needs to be fun. It just needs to be exciting. But if that's the story that you're trying to tell, like, lean into it and let it shape the world that you're trying to build, because we have that luxury as fantasy authors that we can play anywhere on that spectrum between, classic fantasy setting and something, that could really change the way people think about the world around them, and it's okay to be anywhere on that spectrum. But if it's important to you, then like lean into it and find out what it means for those characters and your world. My dog wants to be on the panel too.
Yeah, that's a really good point you make. Yeah, 'cause I was chatting to Denise Crittenton on the show, and she's an Afrofuturist writer, and she wanted to create a world in which everyone was black. White wasn't a thing. And I thought that was a brilliant example of creating the world that you want. So yeah, there's a question now that we've had quite a few people mention and sort of allude to in various forms. And it's a bit of an awkward one, I think, when it comes to writing. I was chatting to a guy yesterday about it, and he was having a lot of trouble getting his head around this, is when you're editing and there's a lot of material in there, let's say. Stripping it back, it can be quite a difficult task, and I know I've been in this position before, where you feel like you feel like the reader has to know this information, that they just can't work it out for themselves. This has to go in here, and you just end up info dumping essentially, and it's you're not trusting the reader. There's no sort of relationship of trust between you and the reader, and in the end you just end up telling them everything and spewing it all out. And he was just having a really difficult time accepting that he has to take that out, or he should consider taking it out to make it a bit more interesting and streamlined. And I'm just wondering, because it seems like it's difficult. It's obviously you've created all these wonderful details, and you just want to get them in and show the world how great this place is. How do you overcome that? Have you been in this situation before, and what have you used to sort of turn off your feelings and just cut it all out with the vicious red pen?
Well, I haven't done a lot of editing. I'm working on my first novel right now, and so I haven't finished the first draft yet. But this is just an idea I had, and feel free, you guys, to completely smash me on this. But I thought a good way to do it, if you really want to get this information to the reader, why not create a history novella of your world? So like just create a whole different document, and you can put as much world building detail as you want into it, and have it as either a glossary in the back of your book, or like a little snippet, or just a whole nother thing that you can put on like your website for like fans that like your book and want to learn more about your world can read.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a good way, because then you're not like completely divorcing yourself from all these fantastic, juicy world building details, but you're also not clogging up your story. Also, I want to add in really quick. Wendy has a question that's a bit long, and I was thinking maybe after we finish this question, we could ask.
Definitely, yeah. Definitely, yeah. Nice.
I'm currently in that place right now with my writing group where we're going through, and I'm really using them because I know that's something that I needed to do, and I've always been aware of that. But I actually did what Joshua said. It's a whole nother document. It might be published as an appendices or, you know, its own standalone or be a freebie online, but also make a cut doc where you dump all of those things into, and it makes it easier because you're not just like deleting them into the ether. Like they're there if you want to go back to them and add them, but make sure that they're doing something for your story and for the plot, and not just for you to share that information. Like make sure whatever it is serving a purpose in the narrative. And if you can do it through discovery or through action, like think like a director, you know, and it's okay to hone in on some of those small things, and the little details will make it feel more fleshed out than it actually is. And you do need to trust your readers to make inferences about the world from what you're presenting them. But yeah, keep it tight. Don't be afraid to chop that stuff out. It's just gonna keep people from getting to that point where they want to know everything about your story, right? So get that red marker out and go ham. But just, you know, leave a pile of bodies on the side that you can resuscitate as needed. It'll make you feel better about chopping them out.
I think part of the joy of doing world building is I create like a world Bible that has a lot of this extra information in, and it exists as a separate thing. And you might only find out 10% of it in the story, but the rest of it still is there. And like Jonny said, if it doesn't serve the purpose and it doesn't come up in the plot, it shouldn't be there. I'm not, you know, if I say that the coins are called sheks instead of pounds, and that's it, I'm not going to give you a 10-page thing on why they're called sheks unless it comes up and someone says, well, why are they called sheks? But then why, they already know that. Why would someone ask someone else, why do you call it that? So there's no point that, you know, I've written a 10-page thing that explains it's based upon this emperor and blah, blah, blah. I don't care. The reader doesn't care. It's a tiny detail in the story. That isn't the story unless the main character is fascinated with coins for some reason. You know, it's one of these things that some authors have really, really big doorstep of books. And I like some of them. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it and they aren't good. But I feel in my own writing, I don't want that. I'm bored. If I'm bored writing it, it's going to be boring to read. So I'd rather have stuff in there that serves the plot, serves the characters, and makes the world feel a little bit different without just bogging down the pace. Because you know there's so many distractions these days from everything for people's times. You're constantly fighting. And sometimes it is nice to soak into a book and just be absorbed by it. A lot of people aren't built that way. They just want to read a book and have a good adventure and feel like it's a different place. So you do a charcoal sketch of a character and they fill in the blanks themselves in their own mind. Every version of every other character in every book is slightly different because it's based upon the version that you've created in your mind. It's different to mine. It's different to everybody else's. So it's have your world Bible, have it somewhere else. If you then want to do some other cool stories that explores a different part of the world that doesn't feature in the main novel as a separate novella, great. You've got all that detail that's already set up. Have fun with it. Build out the world. Like Ryan Cahill has done a novella. He has like the first novella that's free and then a main novel. That might have a bunch of stuff that's not directly linked to that first book. You don't have to read it, but you could, but it gives you a whole bunch of extra stuff. So there's different ways now with, you know, self-publishing and even being a hybrid author to do that and have more stuff set within the same world. What about the Expanse books? They did a bunch of novellas, have background stuff on all the characters. So one of the main characters, we find a little bit about him that he used to work in a brothel, blah, blah. And then there's a story that they've released about his early years, about growing up on Earth, what it was like for him. But I didn't need to know any of that for the main plot to follow the story. We just told about it in passing. But if you want to go back and read that thing, you can now, but it's not necessary.
Yeah. It's great, isn't it? As you're sort of going through and you're seeing all these potential avenues that you can go down, and it's not like just knowing, I suppose, it's like, I'm going to save that one for another time. Whether you'll ever get to it is another matter.
And I also think it matters like the subgenre that you're writing in fantasy, because if you're writing like high or epic fantasy, your readers will expect more information on the world. They won't mind. They are actually like, they want it. But if you're writing in maybe some other subgenre, they will be more interested in the characters, so you can move more quickly. I do think what Steven said is like the thing. If you have to describe something, only if it matters for the character. So he wouldn't describe the coin unless the character is like fascinated by coins and it matters for them. So you only show, and if you have to show, how do you show it? Why does it matter to your character? Why is he noting them, and why is he like actually looking at it and thinking about it, and then it makes sense instead of just out of the blue.
So it could be really minor, like if someone looks at a coin and someone else remarks on it and says, the king's just died. Oh, I see, they printed a new coin. They got through that pretty quickly. You're like, oh, right. So someone's been deposed and straight away they've reprinted the coins to kind of move. That's an interesting detail. It adds to the world. It tells you something and you move on. I don't tell you how the coins were made and what it's, just, I don't need to know. Like if it's important to the plot and the change of government and power, great. Then you move on. The rest of it, I don't care. And I don't think readers do most of the time.
Yeah, I think Stephen really nailed it there, because I was going to say, as Izo was talking, I think it's about the economy of words. You can do a lot with a little bit. You can give people a little slice, a little, I call them breadcrumbs or something like, that makes you feel like there's more there. It's the tip of the iceberg. They don't need to know what's under the iceberg, but just knowing that it's there, it's going to make your world feel more fleshed out. And so those things are important. We don't, you don't want to gut your world of those things, because it's what's going to make it feel unique. But don't feel like you need to do a 10-page thing about the coins. It's a perfect example that he did it in 2 lines there. It's probably like 25 words and you got a lot there. So it's, use those details, but the economy of words is super important, and you can do it. Just find fun ways to do it, and they'll pop into your head at silly times. You're like, oh, this is where I could put this in there.
Yeah. I think like one thing that I saw from Emily in a question about when we like address really big things and really big changes about world building, and the reader doesn't know, but all the characters would and wouldn't really think about talking about it. What Stephen brought up sort of sparked this idea in me. Why would you talk about the coin unless you're a coin enthusiast? Or like if it doesn't matter to the plot, only a coin enthusiast would talk a lot about coins. So for your story, either have your main character be very interested in that piece of world building or a side character that they talk to. And that's a really great way to get a lot of information. Like for example, if any of you have read Steelheart, the Steelheart series by Brandon Sanderson, he does this very well where the main character is a nerd about all the superheroes. And he just describes them in detail because he's a nerd. He's a super nerd. Yeah. And so have a super nerd for your world building in your story.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
I can't remember which. I don't know if it's E.J. Beaton's The Counselor or something, or one of them. I can't remember which one it is, but the main character's like a food taster, so therefore they know everything about food and poisons. So therefore you're going to get information about plants and poisons and what they smell like and what they would initially taste like, because it's important to the plot. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be in there, and she wouldn't have this kind of detail in. So there again, whether it's coins or poisons or whatever it is, you've added to the world. If it serves the purpose, have it in. Otherwise, mention it in passing and move on.
Nice, great. I think that's I think about all the questions I've got. Has anyone got any other questions for Steve?
May call on Wendy.
Oh yeah, Wendy's question. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Hello, Wendy.
Hi, how are you? I never do these on my phone, so I apologize. Oh, there I am. Okay. I'm sorry for the long question. I'm writing a historical fantasy, and you mentioned the thing about the coffee, which got me thinking. It's a Norse fiction, historical fantasy, and so I'm doing a lot of research on Norse mythology and Viking life, things like that, to really give my story the feeling of the Norse life, to make it richer and more believable. However, in this particular book, I'm not mentioning, like, it all takes place in the village over 12 days, and well, 13 days actually, but I'm not mentioning the name of the village. I'm not mentioning this is in Norway or Iceland or Greenland or any of the places where Vikings were established. It is. Do you think that that's a problem? I'm mentioning mythology, the way, some things about the way of life, but I didn't think that they had to be in the story. So I'm just wondering, because it is a historical fantasy, but it is a fantasy, so I'm writing it. You see what
Yeah.
I'm having such a hard time putting my question into.
Oh, I think we understand it there. Yeah, Steve,
Oh,
you're
good,
the
good.
historical fantasy.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
doing it now. So think about it. If you're pitching your book to someone like you've just done to us, what year is it set in roughly?
I don't know.
Or what century even, based upon the
Yeah.
technology that they're using?
Yeah, there's no technology. It's all swords and
Sorry,
Yeah.
you know.
I meant in terms
Yeah.
of, you know, the technology of the era, of the period that it's set in.
Yeah, I haven't worked that out.
Okay, but
It's ancient Norse, so
so you do know roughly which country it's set in? If it's not, so
No,
the reason I asked
yeah,
is,
Norway. Norway.
okay, so when you're pitching this book to someone, when someone walks into a bookshop and they pick it up and look at the back, the only reason you need to know a little bit of that, and it doesn't have to be in the story or described, is in the back it will say 1160 Norway, Johnny the Viking, blah blah blah, goes and does this, he's fighting, blah, and that's it. You don't need to say anything else. It doesn't need to pop up, because someone's not going to turn to someone else and go, well, now that we're in 1260, it's quite an interesting year. Yes, it is. Yeah, it doesn't need to be that. So in the front of my Judas Blossom, okay, there you go. In chapter 1, it says part 1, chapter 1, 1260. And then we start the story. I don't, and the fact the back of the book says 1260 Persia, and off we go. So
Yeah.
that dictates the technology, that dictates the temperature, the belief system, and everything else that you've done your own research that'll feature into that. So you give people like Johnny was saying, the breadcrumbs. So whether it was a Bronze Age story or a, you know, modern story or whatever it is, that will dictate the technology, the weapons, the society, everything. And the country will give people clues. And that's all you kind of need to do. So work out roughly what century it is, depending on what kind of weapon. You could just say 7th century Norway. And that's it. You don't need to worry about anything else then. The historians can have as much fun as they want looking up stuff and saying you've got it wrong, except that it's fantasy, so it doesn't matter.
Right,
So
right.
let them have a hissy fit. It doesn't matter because it's fantasy. So
Yeah.
just work out roughly where and when, roughly, and then
Okay.
forget about it and don't stress
Mm.
about that. Just tell the story that you want to tell.
Okay,
Nice.
that's what I needed to know. Thank you
Good.
so much.
You're welcome.
Nice one, Wendy. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
We've got a question here from Graham. Short of it is, how do you find unique angles when it comes to building worlds, and specifically magic systems? Anyone got any advice to share there?
I've built a lot of magic systems for my worlds. I think the mashup method is best. Like, take some things that you really like and you can put them together. You know, nature is lit. Be curious about science and the world that we live in too, because a lot of times you might be inspired by that. Like, some of my best fantasy world building ideas have come from, you know, nature and science documentaries and learning about the world that we live in, and just how, you know, our own perspective sometimes keeps us from understanding like how bees communicate, or how, you know, the mycelial network works. Like, all those things are so fascinating and can just really differentiate, you know, your world. Or using, you know, like Stephen just did, a lot of authors are doing it, a lot of editors and agents are asking for worlds that are not based on, you know, the standard you know, Western fantasy worlds. So like, look at different cultures. Like, there's a website called Encyclopedia Mythica where you can look up different myths and legends and creatures and stuff from around the world, and from like cultures in Africa and the Middle East and Asia that maybe you might not be as familiar with. And you can find some really cool stuff by just staying curious. And, you know, you might discover something really resonates with you or fits really well into your world, and just steal it. Like, it's fantasy. Everything is stolen. You don't need to worry about borrowing ideas from things, or you want to, you don't want to appropriate a culture or anything like that. But using those things as inspiration is smart. It's going to make it identifiable to your readers. It's going to give you those tools to already, like, I have a race that's kind of a mashup between like Naruto and samurais and an empire, and it's fun. Like, just let it be fun, let it be, and those are all, not original things, but fantasy is all borrowed. So, don't be afraid to borrow from things that you like and that speak to you, and, find just small ways to twist them that will make them feel unique.
Whatever
Yeah.
your interests are. So if you think about Adrian Tchaikovsky, so he loves insects. That's one of his hobbies. He loves bugs. They're just his thing. He digs them. A lot of his stories have them in.
Yeah.
His first 10-book fantasy series is called Shadows of the Apt. And all of the different races are based upon insects. And therefore, each race has a different magical ability based upon their race. So the ant race essentially are all telepathic. Each hive can communicate. Each ant within that whole hive can talk amongst themselves, which makes them, and then you think about, what does that mean? So when you fight, they're a nightmare because they're all coordinating all the time. And if there was a breach, they can immediately patch it. They don't need to shout the orders. They just tell each other telepathically. You've got the bee kingdom, who've got this kind of like sting, but it's quite dangerous. You've got the wasp kingdom, you do it all the time because that's how wasps are. And you got spider kingdom, you've got mantis kingdom. It just like, and you start spinning off all these cool ideas, all just based upon the fact of things that you can relate to based upon insects, because that's his thing. So whatever the thing is that you're into, or several things, like Jonny was saying, mash them together and go off and have fun. Just have a good time with it.
Yeah. Like, my piece of advice on this thing is that, let's say specifically what you said about your magic system with the gems, right? And Brandon Sanderson, the Stormlight Archives, talking about his magic system with the gems. My recommendation is ask questions about it. Like, for example, where did the gems come from? That can change everything. Because that will change the quantity of the gems, how easy they are to get, how easy they are to acquire. And then you can ask, how do the gems store the magic? Like, come up with insane ideas, because insane ideas are usually the best ideas.
Mhm.
But just come up with crazy ideas. Like, what if instead of the gems like showing light, becoming light when they get magic, what if they get dark, right? That's just a twist, right? If you just twist something, it'll automatically become different. If you just keep twisting it, eventually it's going to be something new, right? Just take it farther and farther and farther. And there are going to be stupid ideas. I mean, that's just how it is. You just got to throw those out or save them for another story. But eventually you're going to have something that's so different and unique that maybe it started from the same base, but you've changed so many things that it'll be very fascinating.
And I would also argue, like, there's a lot of magic in our world, like the name of the wind uses a type of magic that it's sympathetic, sympathy. And it actually like a real life kind of magic. Like, people used to believe in sympathetic links between things that were similar. So we can, like, every prayer is kind of like a little spell. So you can look at the magic that it exists. And I'm saying this very loosely, guys. Please don't be mad at me. But like those wonders that we find in real life and apply to your magic system. And also like technology. Technology can be magical. Like, a lot of technology is magic. Like if someone just came from the past and look at a TV, look at what we are doing now. This is magic, right? So you can have mirrors that you can communicate with people like Zoom, like a Zoom meeting. And that's a lot of fun.
Nice.
Yeah, isn't
There
it
you
Arthur
go.
C. Clarke who said any sufficiently advanced technology will look like magic? I think that's what he said. Something I'm paraphrasing, but yeah, it's something like that.
That's sci-fi, right? That's just the sci-fi genre, basically.
Yeah, it's all magic.
Well, yeah, so there's a cool middle ground between there too, and you don't have to you don't have to explain, like, look at, I think most people are familiar with, the series Game of Thrones, Song of Fire and Ice, all of that. He hardly explains anything. He just literally is like, yep, and she hatched 3 baby dragons and stepped out of the fire unscathed. Like, you never understand how any of the magic works. The faceless men, you kind of get an idea, you know, like no spoilers there, but like none of it is explained. So if you're not going to have it like be explained, make it so cool that nobody cares, right?
even like the seasons, right? They have like long seasons, summers that last years, and winters. Like nobody's questioning how that worked with Earth moving away.
And the 2%
right?
of people that can figure it out and tell you how it should have been, you know?
Unless it's an important thing of the story. So has anyone read like Grey Sister, the trilogy by Mark Lawrence, something of the ancestor? This isn't a spoiler, it's part of the story. The whole planet is freezing over, and the only thing that's keeping a strip around the world livable where some people live is this kind of advanced technology that, if you take a step back from the story and you think about it, you realize it's some kind of satellite that's reflecting light from the sun onto this planet that keeps the ice back. And they start yeah, so the characters don't really understand it, but we as readers kind of get a little bit more because of who we are and what, you know, what century we live in now. But it's a fascinating view, and that's an aspect of the story, but it's not the whole story. So that kind of thing, and it seems like magic to them, as we're going, you know, it's just a satellite with like a panel and a dish, and it's reflecting. And yeah, all right, okay, sure, let's say it's magic. Yeah, cool.
Yeah. I experimented a bit with that with cannons. So so like I always loved the description of from medieval times of cannons being these tubes of thunder, because no one knew what the hell they were, and they made noises like thunder. So that's what they could only liken it to, the sounds that they were familiar with. And they were absolutely useless. They didn't hit anything, but they were they were quite impactful in getting people to turn and run. So I just love playing with that idea.
Yeah, it's fun to explore too. Like, you think about how people explained science throughout all the different ages and the different, you know, the origin stories around the world are just like, you know, so fascinating, from, you know, being under a turtle's back, and then you've got the whole, you know, Greek pantheon, and you know, and then they kind of like shifted it, the Romans, like, you know, there's all this crossover and intermingling and stuff that happens. So look at history for inspiration too, if you're stuck in your own fantasy world, or if you're writing in a historical fantasy world, you know, get into some of that history, and you'll find a lot of really fun things, you know, to play on. And ask people, ask an expert. You'd be surprised who would actually respond and reach out to you if you know, look up professors of, you know, certain types of history or something that have public facing, you know, social media or emails. A lot of people will get back to you or answer a couple questions or set up their time. So just stay curious, I think, is important.
Nice. I think that's a good point to end, staying curious. Thank you very much, everyone. This has been really, really interesting. I've learned an awful lot, and like you say, you benefit from everyone's perspectives on things. So thank you very much. And thank you especially to Stephen, being our special guest for our first one. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Cheers, mate.
When's the next big novel out?
Judas Blossom comes out on the 11th of July, book 1 of the new trilogy. I'm currently writing book 3 at the moment, so there you go.
Oh, very good. I'll put a link in the description, in the Discord chat, sorry, for anyone who wants to pre-order. But thank you very much. We really appreciate it. It means a lot to have someone like you to come along and answer our questions and help us. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
All right, thank you very much, everyone.